Welcome everyone to today's Edison Electric Institute webinar on the future of hydrogen and Jemena's power to gas trial. My name is Vanessa Ferrero and I'm a manager for international programs at EEI. Today's discussion features Jemena's managing director, Frank Tudor, who will discuss the company's Western Sydney gas project. Before we get started, I want to go over some housekeeping items and remind everyone of EEI's compliance with antitrust laws. As you all know, EEI and its members are committed to full compliance with all laws and regulations and to maintaining the highest ethical standards in the way we do business. This commitment includes strict compliance with federal and state antitrust laws. Throughout this session, we encourage you to join in the conversation by submitting questions using the chat feature. The webinar presentation and recording will be made available to all attendees after today's session. Now I will turn this over to Lawrence Jones, Vice President for International Programs at Edison Electric Institute, who will moderate today's session.
Thank you, Vanessa, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar conversation with my good friend, Frank Tudor. Frank, welcome to EEI.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Frank is as Vanessa mentioned, the Managing Director for Jemena. He's also involved in a lot of different initiatives in Australia, specifically as it relates to customers, as well as some of the work that I know that has been done within the Australian Energy Market Operator, where Frank has been serving in some advisory role. And also Frank is the Vice Chair of EEI's advisory group for the Asia Pacific region. This morning or evening or afternoon, we're going to be having a conversation with Frank on this very important project that that's related to hydrogen. As we all know, hydrogen is now the topic of the day when it comes to the energy fuel of the future. One of those being discussed. Obviously, there are myriad of issues related to hydrogen, and I believe what is being done in Australia today is going to set the scene for what happens in many other parts of the world. So Frank, we look forward to your presentation, and after that we'll have a conversation with some question and answer. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. I appreciate it's a very diverse group. So my intention was to introduce my company, talk a little bit about what the context is for hydrogen in Australia, make some comparisons in fact to the US as well, and then work my way through to the project that we're involved with specifically, and then sort of naturally conclude and go into the Q&A with you. Firstly, I hope everybody can see the slides. Perfect. So on the next slide, just a little bit about the company that I represent. We operate exclusively in Australia across a number of different market segments that are put up. Electricity distribution in Melbourne, gas distribution in Sydney. Electricity markets is something that we're developing as a line of business, and then gas markets, we own quite a number of gas transmission lines across the country. Interestingly, the name Jemena is taken from the Wadjaman language group. It's a group of Aboriginal people that reside and have resided for tens of thousands of years in the Northern Territory. And the words Jemena, or the word Jemena, means to hear, to listen, and to think, which in this pretty busy day that, or busy environment, busy world that we have, is a kind of interesting point of reflection for us when we think about the company we work for. If we go to the next slide, this is where a lot of our assets are positioned, and this is effectively Australia. So from the east coast to the west coast, you're looking at about 4,000 kilometres, and from top to bottom, Tasmania's little island down the bottom to the top of Cape York in the north, that's almost 4,000 kilometres as well. So when I took up my position in Jemena, the one thing that I observed being a Western Australian is that we had a lot of assets in the East Coast, but very little in the West. So one of my ambitions is to make sure that we balance our portfolio and actually expand into the West. But you can appreciate, as I'll come to, that it's a pretty vast country with a very small population. So by comparison to the US, the connectivity is pretty thin. We can go on to the next slide and I can actually start to highlight some of those comparisons. So in terms of population, we're 25 million, the US 330, that's close to 15 times the population. If you have a look at the landmass, very, very similar. And then if you look at consumption, that's in proportion to the population. But what's interesting, I think, is that we are a significant exporting country of energy. And I'll come back to that. And then you can see that we've got about 16 million electricity connections. In the US, it's 145. We've got about 1.5 people per connection. US has got about 2.5 people per connection, which gives you a sense of the density. So we're pretty sparsely populated. So we've got less people per household. But having said all of that, if you look at the last statistic down the bottom, 85% of the population live within about 50 kilometres of the coast. So we're pretty much a big donut. And in fact, we're not quite a uniform donut. As you can see, the eastern seaboard is where that sort of aerial nighttime shot shows up all the lights. So we've got a heavy population base, which is based on the East Coast. And really, the north and the west is very, very sparsely populated. And you go back, you wouldn't be surprised then that on the electricity side, we have what we call the national electricity market, which connects most of the East Coast, but doesn't go right across the country into the West and doesn't go up to the Northern Territory, simply because of the distances involved and the fact that across that vast country, there's very, very few people. So we've got basically, a two-system electricity or three-system electricity network in the country. Gas is pretty similar. That's not connected across the country, but we have got gas connections from the Northern Territory all the way through the East Coast. But again, fairly thinly connected, but we have most of our gas concentrated in the West and pockets in the East Coast, which I'll talk to a little bit. Next slide. To give you a sense of, this is a snapshot taken, I think, from a government website, talks a little bit about what our energy composition looks like. 2019, I think, was the basis for the statistics that you're looking at. So energy consumption 2019 was up, productivity had improved, but you can see that if you come down a little bit, that we're still heavily dependent on fossil fuels. So you can see there that 56%, 21% comes from coal and gas, 21% from renewable energy. And where you see the slide, where you see the little quadrant there with 50%, it's kind of an interesting statistic, because that 50% increase in solar is not centralized solar. That's solar that people are putting onto their rooftops. And one of the interesting facts about this country at the moment is that we have probably about 10%, 15% of our installed capacity sitting on people's rooftops. So we have probably 2 million of our 10 million customers, electricity customers, with solar panels. And we're expecting that probably by even the end of this decade, that could be up to 40 gigawatts, which is almost the entire installed capacity that we need in a particular day. So it's huge revolution that's occurring, I think, on the electricity side of the country's energy makeup. And then you can see that natural gas is very much a critical part. We've obviously got 20%, which provides electricity generation. Natural gas production growth increased through 2019 by 16%. And what's pretty clear is that we're a very significant exporter of energy. And that's probably a good cue to go into the next slide. And this maps out the exports that we as a country push out. And you can see that coal, predominantly coking coal, is huge. We're probably the world's largest exporter of coking coal. Natural gas exports, both from the East Coast and the West Coast. For a period at least, we were equivalent to Qatar and the world's largest LNG exporters. We're probably fourth or fifth in terms of uranium that we're exporting as well. And then you can see that the rest become quite small. And largely we've consumed most of our indigenous oil and we've become an importer of refined products on the oil side in terms of gasoline and other things. What's interesting, I think, is that where you looked at energy consumption per capita, we're quite close to, I think, we're 0.75, I think, of the US. So US is 322 gigajoules per person. We're about 244 in terms of what we consume inside the country. But when you look at our production, which takes account of export, that goes up to 776 per person. That's gigajoules per person, which is about 2.4 times the US. So we're a significant exporter of energy. And as you look at this slide, one of the interesting things that comes out of it is that, you know, there's a song, I think, that talks about the land of plenty down under. And it gives you a sense that we have had access, particularly to coal for domestic, you know, generation. And until recently, with the focus on obviously decarbonisation, energy policy hasn't been a big feature. We haven't, as a government and as a lot of people that are invested in the industry, had to think about it a lot. We've certainly created the market rules around how the electricity market works, but that was more about functionality rather and based on old technology. And what we obviously are now finding is that there's many things that are becoming concerning, obviously energy security, the take-up of renewable energy, obviously the decline or the retirement of a lot of fossil fuel, that is all playing. And in this country in particular, the take-up of distributed energy resources that I referred to is going to become a really significant issue, which is causing a lot of thinking to be done in terms of how that's accommodated, business models, the roles and responsibilities, how they will change, and how we indeed look after customers through the process. That's going to be fairly significant. We go to the next slide. Then talking a little bit about hydrogen. Given that I'm not sure where everybody in the audience sort of stands in terms of their knowledge, let me say a few things in terms of introducing hydrogen. That is the most ubiquitous molecule in the universe. Having said that, it doesn't appear on its own. It's either in the form of water or other things. So one of the challenges that we've got, because it's got some pretty interesting properties that are really quite unique and I think attractive as we think about decarbonisation, is that you know, how can we work with hydrogen? It's versatile. It's a great energy carrier. It is available. How could we work with hydrogen, particularly to look at decarbonisation in the industries that we've got in the country? The other thing I'd say about hydrogen, because it's important, it has about a third of the energy density of natural gas. And that is an important point because it comes to things that are formidable challenges that we need to look at the moment in terms of transportation. And certainly when we think about export, that becomes an issue. But if you look at what we've got here, it's basically the cycle for how we would produce green hydrogen. And many of you may know that most of today's hydrogen is produced, and people have had a lot of fun calling the way hydrogen is called, produced either brown, grey, blue, turquoise, green, and most recently I came across pink, which is produced from nuclear sources. But brown hydrogen produced from coal gasification effectively is what probably produces about 20% of today's hydrogen. And today's hydrogen is predominantly used in refining processes and the production of various chemicals. So it's fairly niche and it's not used as an energy source in its own right. Grey hydrogen, which is from steam, from reforming basically methane with steam, passing over catalysts and producing hydrogen, is the predominant form of production today and the most cost effective, and that produces about 80%. What we've got up here is green hydrogen, which has become quite a focus, and certainly what we're focused on in our project. And green hydrogen is basically, putting electricity through an electrolyzer to actually split water into hydrogen and oxygen, which is released harmlessly to the atmosphere, and hydrogen, which is then in some way gathered and stored or used for a number of purposes. And I'll come back to what we're doing in our project towards the end. So that's the cycle. One of the issues with this cycle is the cost, pretty clearly. We're looking at $6 to $9 per kilogram. $1 per kilogram of hydrogen is probably the equivalent of $7.50 per million BTU. So it gives you a sense of where we're starting from in terms of being competitive with natural gas. Natural gas prices in this part of the world are probably about 7 or 8. So when you're talking about 6 to 9 per kilo for hydrogen, there's a considerable challenge that we have to get the cost down to a level where we can actually introduce hydrogen into those uses where we can effect decarbonisation. The challenge that we've set ourselves, and there's work that's been done, it's aspirational, but certainly by 2030, 50, we're focused along with the rest of the world on trying to get hydrogen from green hydrogen, that is down to about $2 a kilo. And that's going to get it down to about $14, $15 a million BTU on a comparison to natural gas. And I think Bloomberg suggests that by 2050, we should be able to get that down to $1, which is around $7.50. If you add a carbon tax on top of that, which would penalise natural gas, you can see that hydrogen is potentially going to be competitive. But there is a leap of faith in terms of what needs to happen to bring about the scale, particularly in electrolyzers. So electrolyzers at the moment are very small. So when we come to talk about the project that we have, the electrolyzer is almost, a Meccano type electrolyzer, given the scale that we're going to need to think about in order to start to make inroads into the cost, which is going to be absolutely critical. Electrolyzers themselves, I think, cost around $2,000 to $3,000 per kilowatt. With scale going from, we're talking about a 500 kilowatt electrolyzer that we're installing in Western Sydney. As you go up to 100 megawatts, 300 megawatts, we're hoping that over time that's going to come down to about 500 per kilowatt. We're expecting that the renewable energy cost that goes into providing the electricity for the electrolyzer needs to halve to actually make a difference and get to the $2 that we've set as a target. So that's to give you some sense, I think, of the challenges that we face in making sure that we can get hydrogen to work from an economic point of view. Go to the next slide. I think one of the interesting things is, it was forgotten the man's name, but it was actually an American professor. I think his name is John Bockrus, who was an American academic in South Australia, Flinders University. He coined the word the hydrogen economy back in the 1970s. And I say that because from time to time, people have spoken about the hydrogen economy. It's gained momentum and then it's fallen away. And the question to ask is this another one of those moments? But I think what sits behind this particular slide, which is really important to reflect on, is that there's been some really significant moves towards decarbonisation in terms of countries making commitments to net zero carbon by 2050. I think my sense is that the European Green Deal was probably the leader in pushing Europe towards that. I think in more recent times, the commitment from China, from Xi Jinping to get to net zero by 2060, to reach peak emissions by 2030, was another major segment of the global economy moving in that same direction. And I would say, Lawrence, that the new US administration, with its commitment to, I think, green technology, is probably seeing a movement in the US, which is going to be pretty fundamental. So as we think about that movement towards decarbonisation, we then look at how we're going to get there, moving, and everybody's moving from a different starting point. But we're going to obviously need renewable energy. I think a number of studies have been done globally. I know that Navigant out of San Francisco did some work for European utilities that looked at what's the most optimal pathway to get to net zero by 2050. And, one of the insights which we've replicated here through Energy Networks Australia and Australia is that if you go to full electrification, it is really, really expensive, particularly when you get into the industrial processes, particularly when you think about heavy transportation, when you think about aircraft fuel and things like this. This is an area where it's really difficult to electrify. So that last 20-30% of electrification obviously leaves room for a clean green molecule to replace methane. And that's where hydrogen comes in. So not surprisingly, as you look across the globe, as countries have committed towards decarbonisation, they have mostly picked up on hydrogen as something that's going to provide an important part of the puzzle in terms of how they get there, recognising that full electrification is going to be expensive. So that's certainly, I think, the case here in Australia as well. Our assessment was that if you were to do away with fossil fuels completely and move towards full electrification, the cost difference between a hybrid pathway and a full electrification pathway is something like $16 billion per annum. I think that number in the European context is something like 200 million euros per year. So these are big numbers. So there is a really important driver to see whether we can find a clean molecule, whether we can make hydrogen work for us as that piece that fills that void. We certainly are looking at those hard to abate areas, if you like, those emission pain points. And I think they are in industrial processes, steam, steel, chemical manufacture, heavy transportation. In our own particular circumstance, if we can repurpose our gas distribution business by blending hydrogen, then we're going to be able to utilize existing assets, and that's going to make a lot of sense rather than having to walk away from an enormous investment in pipelines and things that we've put in place in our capital cities. So an enormous driver. I think one of the things I'd call out here as well is that if I needed a tipping point, if you weren't convinced by what I've said, I think, again, looking to Europe, their commitment that by 2030, they will have 2 blocks of 40 gigawatt electrolyzers spread through Europe and outside Europe. That's 40 gigawatts in Europe, 40 gigawatts outside of Europe, suggests that we've now taken on the challenge of scale. We go on to the next one. So hydrogen, a little bit from an Australian context in terms of the potential uses, some of which I've spoken about. Obviously, heating, industrial heating in particular, obviously chemical feedstocks like ammonia, still manufacture potentially, manufacture of chemicals, transportation. I think the race is over probably for passenger vehicles, but certainly in heavy transportation, long haul transportation. Hydrogen has got a better energy density than lithium batteries, not as good as gasoline. So it fits quite nicely if we can get the fuel cells down to a competitive price for it to be able to provide a solution in heavy transportation. And then obviously, as I'll come to talk to, it provides an interesting fit alongside the electricity grid, as that, basically we talk about the convergence of the two networks, the electricity network and the gas network, where the gas network predominantly starts to become, a storage network in a sense. A lot of renewables on the electricity grid that sometimes have to be curtailed. Rather than be curtailed, they can actually drive electrolyzers, which produce the hydrogen, which can be put into the gas network, which provides storage. And that hydrogen can then in turn be used to generate electricity through turbines. So you get a virtuous cycle potentially coming together. But let me, in particular, talk one more that's probably worth mentioning, because we've got some interesting entrepreneurs in our country, and one of them, Andrew Forrest, who's made a lot of money on the back of iron ore production and export to China, is very much focused on the production of green steel. And I think the assessment is that if you can get hydrogen down to about $1 a kilo, if the carbon price was about $50 per tonne, the possibility of producing green steel is very, very viable. And there are many ways, well, there's a couple of ways I think you could probably do that. In the blast furnace, you're replacing coal simply with hydrogen. There are some more novel technologies that are being, I think, used, but certainly that's one of the focuses that we've got. And if you think about Australia as an enormous, probably one of the world's largest iron ore exporters, then the potential for that in that particular production niche is pretty significant as well. Turn to the next slide. So this is a very interesting slide because this highlights a couple of things. One is we sit in a very interesting part of the world where we have strong relationships, long-term relationships, and long-term trading relationships with countries like Japan and Korea. And Japan in particular is interesting. It is very focused when it comes to looking at policy. It's especially in terms of energy. It's had to, because it's largely got no indigenous energy sources, and it needs to import probably close to 94–95%, if not higher, of its energy needs. And we go back in time, and it was the market pool that was created by Japan that I think really gave rise in this part of the world to the LNG industry. And Japan required gas and carefully went about nurturing relationships with different countries, developing gas, and then and that gas was then liquefied and transported into Japan. I make mention of that because as Japan turns its mind to its own decarbonisation pathway, it again is a very small country, heavily populated, very dense. So, and its natural resources in terms of sun and wind are nowhere near as good as Australia's. So there's an obvious synergy between, for example, Australia producing green hydrogen utilising vast amounts of land that we have in the north. I mentioned we were sparsely populated. We've got enormous endowment of land per person. Using that, an enormous and wonderful resource in sunlight and wind, but particularly in the north is for sunlight. There's an obvious synergy in connecting, large solar for the production of hydrogen, which could ultimately be exported to countries like Japan to help them with their decarbonisation program. So the interesting thing is that Japan has put, a 5-year plan together that looks even longer in terms of how it wants to create an international supply chain, mimicking effectively what it did with LNG. And what's really interesting from an Australian perspective is that rarely have we come together in a way that we've created a national policy national policy around energy or part of the energy industry, but we have done for hydrogen. And I think a large part of it is really rising to the challenge that Japan has put on the table in terms of how can you help if we need our hydrogen to actually look at deep decarbonisation of our country. How can you help in the production of hydrogen? How can you help in the export of hydrogen? So that's something that I think has captured the imagination. We've had work that's been done by our chief scientists with a group of very noteworthy academics and industry players pulling together a policy that looks at kind of various elements, and really one significant part of that is how do we build the international relationships and how can we exploit the natural resources that we have for the benefit of ourselves and also Japan and Korea, which is in a similar category. So that is quite exciting. And I think from the country's point of view, we have companies here that are heavily involved in LNG export, and the expertise of production and shipping, the relationships with utilities already exist through these businesses. And if you think on the earlier slides that I showed, what our dependence is on energy exports as part of our economy, it's an imperative for us to think about, as LNG becomes perhaps more of a transition fuel as the world decarbonizes, as coal becomes further marginalized through their process, what do we look to continue to export, and what sort of products can we export that would make sense? And hydrogen obviously would fit into that very neatly. So I think there's a national imperative. We have companies that are interested. We have a government that's put in place the right policy, and we can see the potential market developing through the region. So I think that also helps us deal with the issue of scale, which might otherwise be a problem given the small population that we've got. Go to the next slide, thanks. In terms of what is happening around the country in respect to hydrogen, Lawrence and I were chatting just before we got online, and I think it's right to say, except for the Northern Territory, but probably there's something in there as well at the moment, every state or territory in the country has got a hydrogen project of one description or another. And some of these are pushing the boundary in terms of potential new technology. A lot of them are also just demonstrating that not necessarily new technology. Now, I wouldn't describe our project as new technology, but what it is doing is demonstrating that hydrogen is real for the local community, for the local governments, that it is something that can work, so that it becomes more real in the way that they start to think about their policy. And they're going to be very important because in the context of Australia, if I just put it in these terms, at the moment, every state and territory has got a commitment to net zero by 2050. The federal government still does not. So, it just simply tells you that local government is as important as federal government is as important as local stakeholders and customers. So putting projects in place which demonstrate the viability and the reality of hydrogen is quite important. So a lot of projects there. One I might call out before I talk to ours is the hydrogen energy supply chain. That is an interesting project in itself because that one actually tests the entire supply chain. So I talked about export into Japan. That is a pilot project that is looking at Latrobe Valley coal and the gasification of that and production of hydrogen and the transportation of hydrogen from there into Japan. So it's basically a pilot project with international cooperation that's been put in place to actually start to test the export of hydrogen. It's clearly not green hydrogen, but again, each of these projects does a certain amount to push the credibility in the possibility of what we're talking about. If I move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about our project. Our project is essentially one that has been funded by ARENA, which is a federal government body that is focused on investing in renewable and clean technologies. And the project is essentially a 50-50 joint venture, if you will, between ARENA and Jemena, wholly owned by Jemena, but the funding has come in from ARENA. What it involves is a half a megawatt electrolyzer. That electrolyzer, I think, is of the proton exchange membrane. It's not an alkaline one. And it'll be producing about 53 tons of hydrogen per annum. And the purpose of that is to produce hydrogen. Let me go back to the source of electricity. We've signed up a local company who is providing electricity from renewable sources. So essentially this fits the category of green hydrogen. So we'll be using that electricity to produce the hydrogen. That hydrogen is going to go into a number of places potentially. The primary purpose from our point of view is to blend the hydrogen into a subset of the Sydney gas distribution network that we run. We supply all of Sydney with gas, with a dominant gas distributor there. We're going to be taking a part of the Sydney network, ring fencing that effectively, and then blending hydrogen into that and testing, the issues that go along with that in terms of standards, in terms of interconnections, in terms of appliances and things. But we'll be pushing at fairly low levels, so we don't expect to have a lot of issues. We'll be building that up as we need to. Interestingly enough, back in 1841, some of the gas distribution network that we're talking about existed. And in those days, we were using town gas, which was predominantly 100% hydrogen. So there's a little bit like Lawrence Back to the Future in terms of what we're contemplating, but obviously from a different starting point and a different set of drivers. So the other purpose here is to push the hydrogen into the network, work with local regulators, local authorities to make sure that we cover off all of the standard issues, the technology issues that we need to put in place. We're working with regulators as well to make sure that the gas or the hydrogen that we're producing is being certified as green gas, and working closely with the retailer to be able to market that accordingly. The other thing that we're doing is also we've got a micro turbine which will be generating electricity from putting hydrogen into that to generate electricity to also prove that component. And as that diagram indicates, we'll also be putting potentially in place a refueling station. It's still in discussion, may or may not happen, but we're looking at a refueling station which is going to be supplying either heavy vehicles like buses or SUVs or things like that. And again, this is to prove up the ecosystem, the multi-users of hydrogen, to be able to demonstrate to the local public that this is something that they can start to think about and they can configure into their, their policies and regulations going forward. I think if I go forward one more, I think I'll just summarise and Lawrence, come back to you. A couple of things I'd say. One is that hydrogen is being mainly used as a feedstock in industrial refining ammonia production, methanol production, steel production currently. So we're moving from a pretty low starting point. It is got a lot of potential benefits in terms of its versatility. And I did talk about that niche that it could fill in terms of decarbonisation, which might be prevented from happening if we try and rely solely on full electrification. A lot is being done, I think, across the globe. I think there's some obvious areas that we could focus on, which are the hard to abate areas where I think hydrogen will be most economic. First, like the industrial processes, the steel chemical manufacture, the heavy industry, in our case, repurposing the pipeline, ultimately. The one thing I would caution, and we talk about the hydrogen economy, that hype to reality, we are at a tipping point, I think, in terms of how we bring policy and regulation and funding to bear. I could look at what I put up in Australia, and I could say, look, there's a lot of good, interesting projects there, which are serving a purpose. I could equally turn around and say we're starting to get to the point where we're duplicating, we're funding across a plethora of sort of user cases which might have limited long-term viability and might actually be subscale. So we're at a point where we need to start to focus, and I think the policy setting is there, but we need to start to focus on how do we build a scale, how do we go to the next step, and how do we move from where we are at the moment. And that's very, very important, because you can spend a lot of time doing a whole lot of purposeless trials, which make you feel good at the time, but are not actually pushing you forward. So we're kind of at an interesting tipping point, I think, in terms of where we are. There is a lot that still needs to be done. We are dependent on technical progress to get the cost down. There is a really significant issue with the transportation of hydrogen. You have to send 3 times as many ships to Japan compared to LNG if you're going to be doing hydrogen as a replacement for LNG, and that comes at a cost quite clearly. And I think from where we are now, we need to work to make sure that we now scale things up. And I think a good example of that is Europe. Europe has now committed itself to scale. That's a step that we all need to take. And so that's a challenge in front of us. So Lawrence, I think I'll pause there and hand over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Frank. I think you covered quite a bit of ground, and I like the fact that you laid it out by first beginning to sort of do a contrast between the size of the US and the size of Australia, and look at the necessary sort of drivers for why we want to go down this path. So I have a couple of questions just to dig a little deeper, and I want to start where you ended in the notion of the tipping points where we are. And in terms of scale, what is going to get us to scale hydrogen to the level where we can do the commercialization that is necessary, both for, say, a domestic market in Australia, but even from a global market? How do we scale it up? What's necessary?
Well, if you unpick what's happened in the EU, what sits in the EU is a whole lot of countries coming together under that banner and making a significant commitment to, what did I say, 2 times 40 gigawatts, which is 40 gigawatts is the equivalent of Australia's entire installed generation capacity. Yeah. So I think, it's going to be solved at a country level. I think as we think about scale, what's going to be important for us is nurturing that relationship with Japan, potentially with Korea, that has indicated that they're willing to look with us at potentially, expensive hydrogen, but then work with us to actually bring the cost down as we get the scale and we get the expertise and we get the learnings into, the production and supply chain. Mm. So I think it will happen at a country level in our case. And, in some ways, I look at my old state of Western Australia, where the LNG industry it certainly, when it started there, it was focused on delivering LNG into Japan, and the domestic infrastructure developed on the back of that almost as a slipstream, because our population is so small that we've never been able to justify the investments otherwise. So it may be the same here, that we are scaling up to meet the requirements of a pretty significant market in Korea and Japan. And on the back of that, we can start to take a slipstream into our domestic market through distribution networks, transmission lines, and then get the benefit of that into the industrial processes and things like that. So I think country-to-country cooperation in our case is very clearly what is needed. And I think a great manifestation of that is the fact that Japan has got a policy on hydrogen. We in turn rarely have had energy policy in the past, but we have a hydrogen policy, which is noteworthy.
Well, so that brings me to the issue around getting voters or getting consumers to understand hydrogen, right? So we know the challenge that was beset upon this industry when it came to renewables. It was a long journey to get people to embrace it. And it seems one of the questions here had to do with the issue of the inflammability of hydrogen being highly inflammable. And the questioner raised the issue around reliability and safety. How is that issue going to be addressed?
Well, can I simply say that it is a really significant issue. I started my career at a refinery where we had hydrocrackers and hydro desulfurization units that were dependent on hydrogen. And if you work in that environment, you get to know how sneaky that little molecule can be and how dangerous that little molecule can be. So it is absolutely something that we need to focus on. One of the concerns I would have is pretty much the safety issue. The plethora of projects that I put up, all of those have to be managed immaculately, because if any one of them has an issue, we have this massive negative externality which actually colors the way that the general population will look upon hydrogen and will be set back, even globally potentially, for many, many years. So we do need to focus on that. And I think we can't take any shortcuts. Each of those projects needs to be immaculately designed, engineered. We need to share learnings, best practice. That is all important because, the success of what Ben Wilson is doing in South Australia, I'm dependent on that, and vice versa, the other way around. So I think it is a very critical issue. I think the way that we can demonstrate to the public that this is all possible is, for example, the project that we're developing in Western Sydney. We carefully are looking at, the different uses that we can put the hydrogen to, but certainly if it's going to be put into vehicles and the vehicles will be running around the streets and labelled as such, the more hours, the more kilometres that we get under the belt, that demonstrates that, hydrogen is there. It becomes part of the background. People would become less concerned about it. We need to keep our focus on managing those things, very appropriately from a technical and engineering point of view. But I think that's my kind of comment. So it is very much an issue. It's one of the biggest risks that I see. And we need to be very focused on every little small project that has hydrogen as a label, that it is done well.
Well, I appreciate your candidness here, Frank, because I think one of the challenges we sometimes have with new technology is that proponents sometimes shy away from being candid about the challenges that technology faces. And I think the best you can do now is to sort of be candid with the public and just talk about the challenges facing here. Here is a question about the Australia National Hydrogen Strategy, which I guess sets out to be a hydrogen powerhouse. And the question says, how do you see Australia's potential and competitiveness in a global context with regards to hydrogen?
Well, I think just given what I'd said about our links to Japan and that as a prospective market and where they've got to in terms of decarbonisation and their focus of hydrogen, I think that existing relationship that we have is a point of, I'd say competitive advantage. The fact that we're quite close compared to other countries, it's not that far to Japan, 9 days sailing. to get into Tokyo. We know that because we export LNG there. So, and we already have supply chains. We already have relationships with the utilities there that can be built on with some of the companies already involved in the export of LNG. When it comes, so I think we know the market. We have relationships with the customers. The country-to-country links, I think, are good. When we look at Australia itself, in the northern part of the country, we've got enormous vacant, amounts of land where we can put solar panels, where we can deploy renewable energy on an enormous scale. And the cost of that, I think, would be, very, very, very low. And that's exactly where you need it to be able to provide the affordable electricity that you need for running large electrolyzers or whatever the means will be of producing hydrogen. So I think access and the ability to deploy renewable energy on scale and get that to be very low cost is going to be an important advantage. And I think we, through being heavily involved in the LNG export industry through the companies that we have here, that knowledge, that expertise, I think is transferable to the shipping of, for example, hydrogen and working through the supply chain the same way.
I have a few more questions, one on the supply chain, but before we go to that, I want to broaden the conversation just quickly as it relates to perhaps one of the most populous regions in the world in terms of looking far, which is sub-Saharan Africa. And you talk about green hydrogen, and with its vast amount of solar resource in Africa, what do you see as an interesting connection between Australia and Africa in terms of, if Africa is not supposed to use fossil fuel as being said by many, right? Hydrogen could be the solution. Do you see some form of collaboration being established between Australia and a number of African countries to at least start looking at hydrogen? And how would that work?
Well, I think it's a great I think connection, one that I hadn't thought about. I know that our countries have a strong association. We're obviously heavily dependent in Australia on mining and the mining of resources, and of course Africa is resource rich as well, and I know there's a lot of connections there. So there is a lot of business connectivity between the two countries that could be used as a platform for building the sort of relationships that we're talking about. But you're right, Africa has got enormous resource, and I think it would be something that would be, very interesting to explore. The other thing is, I suspect if you think about Africa as, it's got its own domestic consumption to firstly fulfill, and then has it got export potential. I know that some of the pilot projects, call them research projects that we're doing here, do look at standalone power systems and small modular systems that are also dependent on hydrogen that can be deployed. So there may be, and if you think about getting electricity affordable to somewhere like Africa, rather than dealing with it with yesterday's technology and building out transmission and distribution lines, if you can have distributed energy systems that have dependence on hydrogen, I think that opens up an interesting line of thought.
Interesting. Let's talk quickly about the supply chain, Frank. You mentioned that, and one of the projects you listed was the project looking at the supply chain. So how do you see Australia building out its supply chain for hydrogen, given the fact that you mentioned Japan, but obviously there are other actors in the region who obviously want to be the supplier of electrolyzers and other things? Where do you see the niche for Australia? Is it on the electrolyzer side, or is it on the process side? Where do you see your niche in terms of supply chain for Australia?
I think it's on the production of hydrogen, using our land, using renewable energy, using the ability logistically to get it to the market. I think in terms of the manufacture of electrolyzers, the electrolyzers at the moment are produced in Europe or the US. I think China, people have suggested that the price of Chinese electrolyzers is probably only a fraction of what it is to produce in some of the Western countries. So there's obviously some significant benefits to be drawn from partnering with China in sort of accessing that technology. So I think in terms of working to source electrolyzers, to source equipment that we need to, and configuring it, installing it as a working process plant, if you will, is what we would do in Australia. So it is very, very much like, if you like, the LNG industry. A lot of the key components there are drawn from the US, for example, and assembled potentially in countries like China or Korea or Japan, and then effectively configured and run and operated in Australia because the resource is here. So it would be very similar, operated in Australia because the resource is here. What's the resource? Well, effectively the resource is water, and the resource is access to renewable energy at an affordable rate.
You talked about net zero, obviously, and the upcoming EI Global Electrification Forum is going to be focused on, the title is Destination 2050, and all Australian states you mentioned have net zero targets around 2050. And can you talk about the need for diversification? Because even in the context of hydrogen, there seems to be, I know there was a recent report from Australia. I talked about the role of natural gas in being critical for dealing with renewables. Can you talk about this holistic, very diverse portfolio of resources to meet net zero, and contrast that with some parts of the world where people are saying no gas or no this or no that? You seem to be, or at least Australia seem to be saying, we need a much more holistic, all of the above strategy to be able to deal with the net zero. Do you share those perspectives, if you may?
Yeah, look, I think as our energy landscape changes, we will be, with the 60-70% dependent on coal. That's going to be retired probably much sooner than people think, and that's what we're anticipating. My expectation, Lawrence, is that we'll do what basically the US has done in recent times, where coal has been retired and replaced with a combination of renewables. And I would say, gas-fired generation. In our case, I'd say, because it's occurring later, it's going to be a combination of firming technologies. And, we would expect to see batteries feature quite heavily in that. I'm not so convinced. I think batteries can give you 3 or 4 hours. They can deal with instantaneous interruptions and intermittency. I'm not convinced that in the Australian context, they're going to be able to compete with things like pumped hydro and gas generation that are going to be essential. So pumped hydro, to the extent that it exists in this country, we haven't got the topography that actually supports a lot of that. And, we are a fairly dry country. So I think any site that is reasonable will be developed for pumped hydro. And that gives you, the 8 to 12 hour period to be able to cover intermittency, if you like. And then beyond that, if you haven't got access to sunlight and wind, you need something that's going to be able to sustain capacity day in, day out. And that's likely to be, more gas-fired generation. So, we've had studies that have been done recently which suggest that, our gas-fired generation is going to increase to support to replace coal, but not in its entirety, because renewable energy will be what is predominant. We'll rely on those combinations of firming technologies to be able to give us the stability that we need. So I think that's the kind of that future. It's interesting for us, as I said at the outset, because we have got a lot of wind that we've put into different parts of the country. We haven't got a lot of large-scale solar farms, but we've got an enormous amount of solar on people's roofs. And so one of the challenges that we will have is dealing with increasing levels of distributed energy. And one of the many of the issues we're grappling with at the moment, which is when that gets to significant levels, and in some parts of the country it's at 20, 30, 40%, that presents lots of issues for the distribution network. It presents lots of issues for system operators that may not have full visibility of those individual installations and what might happen to them if you have cloud cover and that. So there's a lot of things going on that are trying to anticipate that. So I think it's kind of it's sort of an issue that we're sort of working through at the moment. But I think as I sort of paint that picture, and as we start to, I fully expect that the federal government has, I would say, moved more towards gas and has talked about a gas-fired recovery coming on the back of the pandemic, to deal with a number of issues that we have got. The connectivity that we need. We've got some of our traditional supply sources declining, and we need to bring in other sources. So we're going to be doing that. So that's going to play a part of the mix going into the future. And as I think we buy into decarbonisation by 2050, that'll start to focus then on how do we, approach those hard to abate areas. And as I say, I could very much see hydrogen developing on the back of export and then becoming a slipstream that comes into the domestic market to support use in those different processes which are going to be otherwise hard to electrify.
Well, we're running out of time. In fact, we've run out of time, but I'm still going to squeeze in 1.5 question, and I say half because one is it's a question that sort of I'm sure you can address, and that has to do with investors, right? And so a lot of the projects you've mentioned are being funded through, say, partnership between, say, the utilities and the government. What sentiments are you hearing from the investment community as it relates to hydrogen? Are they excited? Is it a place where you see them coming with capital, or do you think they're going to wait on the sidelines and say, let's see what happens over the next 5 years? What's the mood of investors when it comes to hydrogen?
Oh, a couple of things I'd say. I think some people might get burnt just in the context of hydrogen economy, and hydrogen is going to solve every problem. We're going to invest a whole lot of subscale, purposeless investment. So I'd be wary of that. I think, we have seen investors focus very much on ESG, environment, society, governance. Sorry, exactly. And so I think if they're focusing on that, it's very hard for them not to focus on what are the solutions that we need to put in place to allow us to move towards net zero by 2050. But nevertheless, investors want a return. So I think government has got a real role to play in building out some of this base infrastructure, as would have been done with the original electricity system in most jurisdictions, I think. Certainly Australia went through the process of it being built up and then privatised. Government is going to need to work in tandem, I think, not only with industry locally to put in place some of that infrastructure, particularly as we think about scale, but equally to be involved in those country-to-country relationships that are going to be important to probably secure the demand and the market that we need to actually underpin some of the investments that we need to make. So I can see that collaboration with a big C is going to be critical.
Well, we're going to wrap up here, Frank, with me asking you the last question, and it's sort of a reflection. The last time we met, Frank, was about exactly a year ago in your office in Melbourne. And at the time, you all had me make some predictions about what was going to happen as it relates to COVID. I remember you specifically saying to me, Lawrence, what do you think is going to happen with this COVID thing? And so now I'm going to put you on the spot by asking you to make a few predictions here, not about COVID. But first prediction, do you think the 2050 target for, say, where you are in, whether it's New South Wales or in South Australia, do you think is achievable? First prediction. And then second prediction, what do you think the price of hydrogen will be by the year 2050?
Yes, and $1.50.
Okay. I'll hold you to that in the year 2050. So, well, listen, Frank, thank you so much. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought on this topic. I think a lot of interest in hydrogen. And thanks to everybody who joined us. Again, this is an evolving topic. We're going to be certainly hearing more about hydrogen over the next 5-10 years. And I think as we go to Glasgow for COP26, I'm sure hydrogen is going to be part of the conversation in terms of one of the many tools in the portfolio to be used to help achieve these net zero goals. So again, Frank, thanks again for doing this. It's a pleasure seeing you. Good luck on the project. And
Thank you,
say hello to all of my friends at Jemena in Melbourne. And I'll turn it over to Vanessa, who has any final word. Vanessa?
Thank you, Lawrence, and thank you, Frank, again for sharing Jemena's vision for hydrogen with us. Thank you to everyone for joining today's webinar. We will send out the presentation and a recording to all attendees, and we look forward to your attendance at our future webinars and virtual events, including our fifth annual Global Electrification Forum, which is taking place from April 12th through 23rd. I've included the link to register in the chat, so you can click on that and find out more about the event. And to continue engaging with EEI international programs and to learn about other upcoming events, please follow us on Twitter or visit our website. Thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, Vanessa. See you, Frank.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Be safe.
Thank you. You too.